In 1920, a Dominican friar sitting in a Paris study with no smartphone, no social media, no notification of any kind, wrote a sentence that describes your Tuesday morning better than anything published since. His name was Antonin-Dalmace Sertillanges, and the sentence goes something like this. The first condition of serious intellectual work is to create within yourself a zone of silence. You've read versions of that idea before. You've probably seen it in Newport. You may have heard it from a productivity coach, a monk on a podcast, a retreat director who recommended turning off your phone for a weekend. The idea of silence as a condition for depth is not new to you, but here is what I want to spend the next several minutes showing you, because I think it changes everything. What Sertillanges meant by that sentence is almost nothing like what the modern world is made of it. And the distance between those two meanings is exactly the distance between where you are and where you're trying to get. So let me start where you actually are. You already know something is wrong. You don't need me to name the symptoms. You've noticed that the quality of your attention has changed, not just at your desk, but at mass, at the dinner table, in the middle of a conversation with someone you love. You reach for your phone without deciding to. You open an app you don't remember wanting to open. You put the phone down and can't immediately recall what you were thinking about before you picked it up. That experience is so common now that we've started to treat it as normal. An inconvenience, a bad habit, something to manage. But I want to suggest that what you're feeling is not a bad habit. It is the symptom of something structural, something that was built into the interior life over years, long before the phone became what it is, and that the phone has simply made impossible to ignore. Sertillanges called the opposite of this condition the zone of silence. And the first thing to understand is what he was not talking about. Newport's deep work came out in 2016, and it gave a generation of knowledge workers a vocabulary for what they were losing. Newport argued that the capacity for deep, focused, uninterrupted work was becoming rare and therefore valuable, and that the way to recover it was through deliberate practice, time blocking, digital minimalism, what he called monk mode. He wasn't wrong. The diagnosis was accurate, and for a lot of people, including a lot of Christians, it was the first serious framework they'd encountered for fighting back against distraction. Newport's silence is real. His techniques work as far as they go, but here is where they stop. And this is the thing I want you to hold on to for the rest of this video. Newport gives you the silence. He gives you the clear desk, the blocked calendar, the phone in the other room. What he cannot give you is what to do with your soul once you're in it. Because what Newport describes is an external condition, and what Sertillanges describes is an interior architecture. Those are not the same thing, and confusing them, treating the clear desk as though it were the zone, is why a lot of people do everything Newport says and still find that the deep work feels thin, still find that the prayer doesn't deepen, still find that the hour of study they carved out somehow produces less than it should. The problem was never only the phone. The problem is something the phone has been living inside of. Here is what Sertillanges actually says. In the intellectual life, his 1920 manual for the scholar who wishes to take up serious study as a vocation, he describes the zone of silence not as a time, not as a method, not as an absence of noise. He describes it as a disposition of the soul. That phrase deserves to be sat with for a moment, because it does something that productivity language cannot do. A disposition is not something you turn on. It is something you cultivate, slowly, through repeated acts, the way a muscle is built, or the way trust is built, or the way a marriage deepens. It is a quality that belongs to a person, not to a schedule. What Sertillanges is saying is that the zone of silence is not what happens when the phone goes in the other room. It is what you are, or what you have become, or what you are in the process of becoming when the phone goes in the other room. And this is where the modern version of the idea completely loses the thread. We have been treating the zone of silence as an external condition to be arranged. Sertillanges is telling us it is an interior condition to be formed. The difference is not small. It is the difference between a technique and a transformation. Now, I want to tell you something about the man who wrote this, because the biography is not incidental. It is proof. Sertillanges was born in 1863 in a small town in the Auvergne region of France. He entered the Dominican order, became a philosopher and theologian of serious reputation, and by the early 20th century was regarded as one of the most important Thomist thinkers in Europe. He preached at the Madeleine. He lectured at the Institut Catholique de Paris. He was, by any measure, a man living in full intellectual exercise. And then Rome silenced him. For approximately 17 years, The details of the circumstances are documented in Dominican historical records and referenced by scholars including James Schall. S.J. Sertillanges was forbidden to publish, to lecture, to speak publicly on the matters he had given his life to. The silence was not chosen, it was imposed. Think about what that means for a man whose vocation was the life of the mind. Everything stopped. The external conditions for his work, the platform, the audience, the permission to speak were taken away. And during those years, or in their wake, he wrote The Intellectual Life. He published it in 1920. He was 57 years old. The man who produced what is arguably the most precise and demanding manual of the Christian intellectual life had just emerged from nearly 2 decades of enforced quiet. That is not incidental. That is the argument. Sertillanges was not writing about how to optimize your study hours when the conditions are right. He was writing from inside the proof that the conditions don't determine the work. The zone of silence is interior, or it is nothing at all. He knew this not as a theory, but as a fact he had lived. Before I go further, and the rest of this video is going to be about what that actually means for your Tuesday morning, I want to mention something I put together for people who find Sertillanges landing on them the way he seems to be landing on you. It's called the Sertillanges Vault. 70 of his most powerful quotes, each one with a 150-word annotation, the full context of the idea, the theological tradition behind it, and one specific application to daily life. It's designed as a reference document, something you print and keep, something you return to, something that puts the raw material of his thought in your hands in a form you can actually use. If you'd like to try it before committing, there are 10 quotes available free as an email opt-in. The link is in the description. I mention it here because what we're about to get into is the part that usually makes people want to sit with Sertillanges directly, and the vault exists precisely for that. Now, back to the argument. Here is the thing about your phone that I don't think the digital detox conversation ever quite names. Your phone is not the enemy of your attention. It is the occupant of a space that was already empty. This is the inversion that Sertillanges forces on you, once you take his definition seriously. The zone of silence is not a condition that technology destroys. It is a disposition that either exists in a person or does not, that has either been cultivated or left uncultivated, built or never built, tended or slowly abandoned. The phone moved into an interior space, but the space was open long before the phone arrived. For many people, and I am not accusing anyone of anything, I am describing what Sertillanges' logic implies. The zone was never fully built, not because of laziness or failure, but because no one ever named it. No one ever said that the interior life requires this specific kind of cultivation. No one ever told you that the scattered feeling you have when you try to pray or read or think seriously is not a personal weakness but an architectural absence. Something was supposed to be built there, and it wasn't, and now the phone has made that emptiness undeniable. Or perhaps for others the zone was built once, in seminary, or in a season of serious reading, or in the years when the children were young and the faith felt vivid, and then gradually, without a single dramatic moment of abandonment, it was let go. The habit stopped. The interior returns became less frequent. The disposition atrophied, the way any unexercised capacity atrophies, quietly and over time. Either way, the news from Sertillanges is not bad news. It is clarifying news, because a disposition that was never built can be built, and a disposition that atrophied can be rebuilt. That is the entire point of the intellectual life, not to describe what the rare genius is already doing, but to prescribe what the ordinary serious person can begin today. He writes, and I am giving you a close paraphrase of a passage from the 2nd chapter of the intellectual life, faithful to his argument, that the worker of the mind must gather himself. That is the act, not the cleared desk, not the blocked hour, the gathering of the self, the deliberate interior return, the act of bringing the scattered attention back to a center. That gathering, repeated, becomes a capacity. The capacity, sustained, becomes a disposition. The disposition is the zone. Do you see what he's describing? It is almost exactly what the contemplative tradition has always called recollection. The drawing back of the scattered self into the presence of God, the act at the heart of serious prayer. Sertillanges is not importing a foreign idea into Christian intellectual life. He is naming something the tradition already knew, and showing that it applies to study as much as to prayer. That the mind gathered for thinking and the soul gathered for prayer are not two different acts. They are the same interior movement, aimed in slightly different directions. This is the sentence that Newport cannot write. Newport gives you the technique for the gathering. Sertillanges tells you that the gathering is prayer, and this is where, if you have been following the argument, something should have just shifted. Because if the zone of silence is a spiritual disposition, if it is the same interior movement as recollection, as the gathered soul returning to its center, then rebuilding it is not a productivity project. It is not a matter of better habits or stronger willpower or a more disciplined relationship with your phone. It is the work of the soul, which means it belongs to the same order as prayer, as lectio divina, as the examination of conscience, as the slow, habitual return to God that is the whole practice of the Christian life. Sertillanges is not adding a new item to your spiritual to-do list. He is naming the missing precondition for everything already on it. Your prayer feels thin? The zone is absent. Your reading stays on the surface? The zone is absent. Your faith feels like information rather than formation? The zone is absent, not because you have failed, but because no one ever told you that this interior architecture had to be deliberately built. And that building, it is itself an act of devotion. It is not too late. I use that phrase rarely, because it only lands when it's earned. But here, it is earned. Sertillanges himself published his masterwork at 57, emerging from 17 years of imposed silence. The man did not produce his finest work in the bright years of early career. He produced it from the interior life he had built when there was nothing else left to build. The years that remain are not aftermath, they are the condition. So let me close with what is actually being asked of you. Not by me, but by the argument. The zone of silence is not something you find. It is something you return to, again and again, in small acts that feel inadequate at the time. You bring the scattered self back to a center. You do it in the morning before the phone comes on. You do it in the 5 minutes before you open a book. You do it at the beginning of prayer when the mind wants to be anywhere else. You gather, you return, you gather again. Sertillanges believed that this repeated act, sustained over months and years, produces not just better thinking but a different kind of person, someone whose interior life has a quality of depth that can hold serious thought, serious prayer, serious encounter with the great dead and the living God. That person is not behind you. That person is still ahead. The question I'll leave you with, and it's smaller than everything we've covered, which is usually how the important questions work, is this. Where in your day does the gathering already want to happen? Not where should it happen, where does it want to? Because in most people's lives, the zone was never entirely gone. It was pushed to the edges. It comes back in odd moments. In the car before you turn on the radio, in the church pew before the music starts, in the few seconds between waking and reaching for the phone. It is trying to reconstitute itself. Sertillanges says, give it room. If there's a subject you once studied seriously, a body of theology, a language, a tradition, a period of history, and then let life take from you, I'd like to know what it was, and whether you'd pick it up again.